Hi, and welcome to Tabletop Tidbits, the video where it's just going to be me and you having a little chat together. And I wanted these series of videos to just be, some casual time with me and you getting to know each other. A lot less produced than the long form videos I usually put out, and of course the fast paced shorts that I put out is just going to be slow, me and you talking about tabletop role playing games. I'm thinking this is the perfect thing for you to, put on the background and just hear my annoying British voice talk about the whole time. And with that, I have a couple of topics I want to talk about, not in this video specifically, but I imagine in future videos, hopefully if there's people who actually want to hear more of this. And today's topic is about design, and more specifically, dice design, or dice mechanics at least. And when it comes to dice mechanics and dice things like that, I always see that nowadays when I look at all the games that are coming out and being released, they're always advertised as the new exciting game with all these different mechanics. And when you actually look at the book, you get a very 50-50 spread. You either get some incredibly interesting mechanics that people sat and thought a lot of time and effort has went into this. Like, oh wow, this is really cool. And the other side of it is people who just go, right, okay, so new game. Let's do what is already out there. And also, as a side note, I was going to call this game, not this game, I was going to call these videos, sorry, diary, because of how people condensed the word D&D into D, the letter N, and then D. But the saner part of my brain decided against that. But anyway, back to the topic. When it comes to dice mechanics, again, you get a very mixed bag. And I think a big reason behind this, and this is a opinion that is going to get me crucified somewhere, is that I'm not a massive fan of D&D clones. And when I say that, I don't mean games that are similar in terms of fantasy, because making a fantasy game is great. People love fantasy. I love fantasy. You probably love fantasy. Loads of people like fantasy. The issue is when it's a D&D clone. And this isn't because I'm saying I don't want people to steal D&D's thunder. In fact, steal all the thunder. Steal every ounce of D&D's thunder. I do not care. I mean, when people say, this is a brand new game, it's going to invoke the spirit of the classics, but when you open the book, you're like, no, this is this is just the old games that we can't get anymore. We can't buy in the shops anymore. We can't go to wherever you get your book. Where do you get a D&D book now? Apart from just a game shop that you can just smell on the high street, because it's like, ah yes, I smell Magic the Gathering. But anyway, wherever you get your books, you don't really get the old books now. You don't get the white box, the red box, and people have almost kind of put it in their heads that they can just get bank off this. If we invoke the old classics, but really, really closely adhere to the old classics and just remake the classics, and we can just give it out to people and they will buy it away. And that's the things I don't like, when it's just a D20, you add your bonus, and that's it. I want a lot more mechanics. I want not like to be weighed down with mechanics. I want there to be more interesting mechanics, not just the D20, not just another game of D20. I know the likes of my favourite games like Morkborg, Dragonbane, they involve rolling a D20, and they're very similar to D&D purposefully because they kind of match the OSR style. But I'd love to see a lot more games that were, even if they use D20s, but a lot more interesting, a lot more provocative and thoughtful in how they approach the design. I always think that board games are a great source of like mechanics and dice mechanics, or just mechanics in general, that are really interesting, but almost seem relegated to board games because they genuinely do fit board games more so than tabletop role-playing games. For tabletop role-playing games, you need a very sort of like adaptable sort of mechanics in places. That's why the D20 is kind of perfect for a lot of games, because it's just 5% increments. A target number, you roll it, you succeed. You don't get much of that in board games where there's a lot more going on. There's a lot more of a single objective, as opposed to a game that needs to consider all the possible options that a player might do. And with that being said, unique mechanics. Well, what games have unique mechanics? And in fact, to anyone that's been on the channel for even just a little bit of time, you know that I'm trying to make my own game, my own games. And this is another thing I want to talk about, not only designing, but the process that I've undergone when it comes to designing and how I want to approach not just designing like the full game in its entirety, but I guess for this video specifically, how dice mechanics have been thought up in my brain. So I guess first of all, I'll go with the stuff on my end first when it comes to the designing aspect of it. I have had a, I guess, moment to sit down and go like, maybe there is something in here that is undiagnosed, because when it comes to me saying I'm going to make Sanctum videos, I'm going to talk about Sanctum, I'm going to make Sanctum, I'll get through the process, and then I'll slowly wane out, and I'll go, okay, maybe I'll try something else. And then I'll make a start on a completely different project, and then the same thing will happen. I'll start another one. And as a result, I think I've went with maybe, definitely not a process that any sort of game company would probably undergo, aka make a bunch of different games for the things that you're interested in. But, as a result, through just making different mechanics in different games, I've unintentionally created a bunch of unique and quite, in my opinion, quite interesting and fun to use and fun to just look at and think how this would work and also get to use it in play sort of mechanics. And through making all these different ones, it's allowed me to sort of compile what I call my sort of font or style, I guess you'd call it. The style of games that I usually try to strive for, and the ones that I try to go for with any type of game that I want to create. When I finally publish my first ever game and every game after it, it's probably going to sort of be in this sort of similar style that I've worked out and devised that actually I really like these sort of core concepts. And those core concepts are, I'm just going to make sure that I've got them down here. The first one is the fact that the mechanics that I implement, I want to go for interesting dice mechanics. I've not yet in my games went, right, roll a d20, and that's like the central rolling mechanic. Instead, I've tried to strive away from that purposefully, almost like the way that authors have that constrained writing. If you've ever heard of that, where they have like books, you open them up and they have some weird arbitrary rule that they've set out, and you have to follow them. Like, for example, this book is written, but all the letters, the like size, the number of characters in the letters is equal to pi. So the first one is a 3-letter word, next one is a 1, next one's a 4, and continuous until you have a full book that is just all the letters of pi, that kind of thing. So with that sort of approach that I always impose on myself, get away from just using this all the time, it's resulted in things like Sanctum, which, if anyone's watched any of the videos on Sanctum, you know that the sort of way that it works is, instead of d20 plus your stats plus your bonuses to see what you get, instead there isn't any bonuses. There's nothing like that. I've played with people who are very, what's the word when someone's not great at math illiterate, I don't know. Anyway, so I've seen people who aren't great with math, and it really does, it's kind of an anxiety point for them. So I thought, okay, if people aren't, enthused by math, who comes to tabletop role-playing games for the math? No one. If you argue and say that someone is, show me that person and I will show you a brick wall. Anyway, so when it comes to the games that I've made, I've tried to incorporate the idea that the dice that you roll is what decides how good you are. When you have your character creation, it's not just, I have a +3 bonus here, +4, +5, +2, whatever. Instead, when it comes to you making a roll and you've got all of your stat laid out, when you just make your character, you then have a selection of dice and you put them in the skill. Oh, I'm not great at this skill, I roll a d6. Oh, I'm really good at something, that means I roll a d12. And that's kind of been the mechanics of Sanctum as like the core mechanic. Whenever you want to roll something, you can select your character sheet and say, right, I'm really good at something, I roll a d12. Or in fact, if I'm good at something and I roll a d10, but I've got advantage, or in the game, a boon, it increases from a d10 to a d12. Again, no bonuses, no rolling multiple dice, just roll one dice, and just the sizes differentiate them. I think that's incredibly simple in terms of a sort of mechanic, and it also makes that aspect of character creation, aka just choosing your stats, incredibly simple, because you don't have to do any calculations at all. You don't need to go, right, okay, proficiency bonus and stat bonus and the score gives you this modifier. None of that. There's no scores, modifiers, proficiency bonus. It's just a selection of dice that you put into your skills and your abilities, and then that's how you do the roll. There's that core concept of trying my best to find something that is different in terms of mechanics, but also simplistic, easy for GMs and players to use. The other things that are involved in my sort of font or style is that a lot of the focus for adventures specifically, a lot of the focus on your mechanics come back to, in some way, your health. Because whenever it comes to the games that we've played for ages, whether it's D&D, Pathfinder, like whatever it is, the games that you play, even video games, a big component of whether you can keep on playing is your health. Whether you're used to the Call of Duty aspect, where your character is basically just invincible because if they get shot, they can run behind a cover and then suddenly all that red jam goes away from their eyeballs. If it's something like Doom, where there's health packs everywhere, that's how you regain your health, but you're at full capacity, always, until your health is at 0. Unless it's Kingdom Come Deliverance, which, your character slowly gets worse and more bedraggled as you get more and more hurt, which, they try to go for realism in that aspect, but when it comes to games, we want a bit more leeway in that regard, so all of the mechanics in Sanctum, the games I've tried to make around it, or in a similar style, they've always went with this idea that the health, your fatigue, those kind of things, are really what makes your character be able to fight on. You can keep going, you can keep adventuring, as long as you have health. So, all the things like armor, obviously, they are to do with your health, or to do with preserving your health, I guess. That's not an abnormal idea, but instead of armor class in that game, again, the dice rolls are incredibly simple, the enemies just hit. Instead, the armor is almost a buffer on your health, because every time you take damage, you passively just get it reduced by whatever the armor score damage reduction is. And also, there's no spell slot, mana points, expendable resources like hit dice, nothing like that. This game, instead, the sort of whether you're in danger sort of territory for your character is your fatigue. Now, this might sound similar to the likes of exhaustion from D&D or other games that might use exhaustion, and I guess it is similar, but one thing that differentiates from it is that built into the idea of all these games, health, of course, when you're at full health, you're fine. When you're at 1 health, you're also fine. It's when you're at 0 that, oh no, something bad happens, and whatever game you're playing, it might be D&D and Pathfinder, and, you decide what is it that happens in those games like D&D. Once you reach 0, you're unconscious, and then you don't get to play anymore. I've always liked the idea that when you are down, you have that sort of Boromir moment of you're swaying and you can't quite hit as good and you're slower, but you can still keep fighting. And then, the big sort of mechanic in all these things is another aspect of your health, your fatigue. And why am I focusing so much on fatigue? Well, fatigue is a sort of building thing that you can gain as opposed to hit points when you lose them. When you gain fatigue, everything's okay. When you gain enough fatigue, if you gain 3 fatigue, you get a -1 bonus in all your rolls. That's bad. And you can gain up to 10, so for every 3, so when you get 9 fatigue, that's a -3. Except, you really don't want to get to 9 fatigue, because when it comes to fatigue, all of your abilities, like making a roll, if you can cast spells, they might involve your fatigue. You might gain fatigue by casting a spell and going, I don't want to lose any more health, I'll just gain some fatigue instead. Or another ability to say, oh no, I failed this roll, but I want to succeed it, so I'll just spend a fatigue. I mean, because the enemies just hit, and because there are some enemies that apply horrific bonuses if you fail a save, as a result, you as the player, almost like how D&D monsters have legendary reactions or legendary resistances, that's it, you as players have your fatigue, and when you fail a save, you go, actually, I'll just gain a fatigue instead and just succumb, and not succumb to that horrific affliction that I was going to take. So, resisting having horrific effects, resisting taking damage, because then also in Sanctum, if you take an absolute welly of damage that's going to knock off your health really quick, you can instead take 1 fatigue. So if you get a massive hit from a dragon just stomping you down, if you have loads of fatigue left, I'll just take a fatigue. But the risk is, whether it's a spell, whether it's an ability, whether it's you're just wanting to succeed a roll, as you gain more fatigue, when you reach 0, that's when you're in danger, because yes, you're not unconscious, but when you reach 10 fatigue, you die, okay? So what's the big deal? When you're at 0, you don't lose health. You gain fatigue for every single time you're hit. So, if you've spent the whole day gaining fatigue by just succeeding all your rolls, by gaining fatigue to stop you getting hit by as much health, when you get to that point where you're at 0 hit points and you have less fatigue to gain, that's when it's bad. And it's almost, you have to play with the risk all of these mechanics go into one pool. It's not like you're split between hit dice, the abilities that have 5 charges, but they recharge on a long rest, and also your hit points. But these things aren't split up. It's just all going back into one pool. Your fatigue. I think it's incredibly simple, and it also allows not only for the simplicity to really show through, but it also allows your characters to have this risk aspect to everything. Every single part of these games, I really want to emphasize the risk, because I think risk drives adventure. So if I can make risk a part of the mechanics of the game, the mechanics of the rolls, the mechanic of whatever it is, I feel like I've succeeded. I feel like if when you're just playing the game, when things are all casual, and you have to take risks to gain a fatigue, maybe do something bad in order to get a great reward, at the risk of later having a very bad time, that's a mechanic that I absolutely love. So I want simplicity, I want risk and adventure to be a part of it, and also I like choice. That's why instead of ability scores and modifiers, that kind of thing, it's just put some dice wherever you want. It's not like if you have a really good body score, that means you've put like a D12 in there. That doesn't mean you have to put a D12 in athletics or heavy weapons, anything like that. You can just choose it. You could be like, I've got a really bad with a D6 body, but for some reason, I have an amazing like heavy weapon skill with a D12, and that is the choice that you can make. You can make it so that how your rolls are made is completely up to you. So that's my thoughts on design. That's my thoughts on the design that I want to bring into my games. And of course, as I said, I went with a bunch of different projects, and as a result, I found a very central design that goes into any of the games I make. But I have made quite a few, and those quite a few have very different mechanics that I absolutely love, and I feel like every single one needs its own game or own release, big or small, just to allow people to explore those sort of mechanics. I'm that proud of which sounds weird, I'm that proud of these mechanics and how fun they are. I'll just sit there and be like, that's amazing, and I'll start to work it out and be like, this mathematically works, it mathematically works, the dice are great, everything's, it fits so perfectly, that's great, and it's different, and it's not just roll a d20, it's not just another d6 dice pool thing. I don't need to force people to buy my own unique dice. They can just use the dice they've got and have a really interesting time placing all the dice and all the modifiers and blah 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 here. So with that in mind, I thought I'd go through just a few examples of that. So of course I've mentioned Sanctum, how you have all your dice and you have to roll, and normally this success state, that's a hard word to say, is 5. If you roll a 5 or higher, you've normally succeeded. If you make an attack roll, if you roll a 5, you succeed, unless you hit an elemental, which is just a quirk of elementals, but don't worry about that. If you roll a 5 or higher, you succeed, but the GM can say, actually, we need a harder roll. So it might be, you need to roll a 7, or a 9, or an extreme, which is 11. And don't forget, you're rolling a d12, so that's incredibly high chance that you're going to fail, but again, it's extreme. It's one of the rarest things that the GM can make you roll for. Maybe they're adamant that this is impossible that you want to try, and you really can't do it unless you roll an 11 or 12 on a d12, so a pretty high chance. The other thing is that, this is a bit of a thing to admit, when it came to game design and making all these games and blah, 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 and the first thing I wanted to make, here's a spoiler, well, not a spoiler, here's a fun fact, there we go, the first ever game that I wanted to make was called Omega. It was a sci-fi game. The first game I ever wanted to make post the OGL thing, when I thought, you know what, I'm gonna make my own game. I'm going to do this. I'm gonna do the thing I've always wanted to do. I've always designed subclasses and races and things for D&D, but now that I feel like I want to do my own thing, perfect. I'll do what I've always wanted to do, and that's sci-fi. I love fantasy, but I absolutely love sci-fi. However, as I went on, I have realised that sci-fi is kind of like the less popular brother. It's the one that people enjoy and might dip their toe into, but overall, people are more focused on the likes of fantasy, which is saddening to me, but I can see why. These people have this perception that sci-fi is much more serious, and to be fair, there are people that are lovers of sci-fi who very much want sci-fi to be the serious aspect of it. They want it to be hard sci-fi, and anything like Star Wars is an aberration, and to be fair, it kind of is for sci-fi. Star Wars is a sci-fi setting, but a fantasy story. It's got a Dark Lord, you know, the noble farm boy saving princesses with his rogue friend and a Chewbacca. I don't know what archetype he has. Sidekick. Anyway, he'd be like Gurgi from the Black Cauldron. Anyway, that's weird. So the blast, yeah. So Omega. It was originally a sci-fi game that I wanted to make, but I did go away from that and decided to go with a more simple and, of course, more unique dice mechanic approach, which was the new game. As opposed to Omega, I called it Blaster, because I wanted to sort of invoke a more fun approach to sci-fi. The blaster-wielding, cape-wearing, gunshot and like daring pilot sort of stuff. The fun, the sort of the bombast of sci-fi. The sort of like fun space opera adventures that people have. I wanted people to experience that as opposed to being forced to just go, right, here's another game where you're in a horse and cart and kings and queens. You can have all these fun and interesting stories that happen out in space with your spaceship, your own spaceship, your mobile little fortress out in the void. I thought all that stuff would be incredibly interesting and super fun if it was a bit more bombastic and wild and quirky and, of course, simple to play. So the mechanic for that is that similar to Sanctum, very similar to Sanctum. However, when I designed this, I was like, I really like this. However, would people be like, just roll a d20? Because the way it works, do you know when I said that in Sanctum you have like your stats, like body, there's other ones like body, mind, will, and, well, in Sanctum it's gear, so it would be gear, body, mind, and will. Well, in Blaster, instead of gear, it's been replaced, and now it's just might, agility, mind, and will. So body, how quick you are, how mental acuity you are, and also will is like your charisma, but also your strength of will, your confidence, your presence, that kind of thing. And you have your 4 stats, and in those 4 stats in Blaster, there's 4 skills. And with those 4 skills, how it all works is, for the 4 stats, similar to Sanctum, you have your 4 dice, your d6, d8, d10, d12. And with the 4 stats, you put one of these dice in one of the stats. So what kind of character are you? Are you a very strong boy? Cool. Put a d12 into your brawn or your might. I forget what it's called. Anyway, the strength sort of score that you have. Maybe you're really bad at charisma or mind or whatever it is, or will, so put the d6 in there. But alongside that, there are 4 skills. And in those skills, you get to make the same choice. With those 4 stats, choose one of these dice. With those 4 skills in one of those stats, you get to put those same 4 dice in each one, meaning that there's now combinations. I've seen this being played similarly with other games, especially, okay, here's one. Mothership. Mothership does this where it's got like skill, and then if you want to do this skill, you have to like look at this little like track to see like what the overall score is. You have to add them together. Instead of that, I thought, you know what would be really simple, but also kind of based on the Sanctum design, but again, really simple to utilize, is if the stat and the skill, when you want to make a skill roll, you have to see what category is it in. So is it your strength and whatever? Is it that? And then you add the skill. So it might be that, let's say it's a skill like athletics, and you have your brawn. So if your brawn was a d12 because you're a big strong boy, but your athletics is good, but you have your weapons as the better thing, so that means you have a d10 and a d12. And then you'd roll those together and make the roll. And the result, the highest you can get on here with a d12 and a d10 is 22. And, the lowest is 2, but this means you might be able to think ahead. If you have a skill that is the worst thing in the game, so for you at least, you have a stat that you're really bad with, your mind, your will, whatever it is, it has a d6. And then in that stat, there's also a skill that is the worst in that particular stat, which is another d6. That means the highest you can roll is a 12, because it's 2d6, and the minimum is a 2 again. And I really like this because it means that I can play around with like difficulties a lot more. The difficulties range from things like 6 to 10 to 14 to 18 to 22, and it means that when you have your sort of dice, you have to really consider, like, how am I going to actually take my actions? Am I going to do the things that I'm good at? Or am I going to do the things that I'm kind of forced to do? The ones that I'm forced to use my d12 but with a d6, and I have to do these combinations together. And I guess as well, people that are coming from other games that use a d20, they might roll things like, oh no, I have a d10 and a d10 here. Oh, that's basically a 20, so I can just roll those and get a similar thing. And one thing that you can do, which is different to a d20 with Blaster, is that With a d20, it's one roll, you succeed, you fail. If you roll 2 dice, the mechanics that I've implemented is, of course, if the result of the 2 together, after you've rolled them, is high enough to beat the difficulty, you succeed. If it's lower, you fail. If the result on one die, the skill die, is higher than the other die, then you get a perk. If it's the reverse, and your skill die is lower than the result on your ability die, you get a setback. Now, if anyone's ever played Powered by the Apocalypse games, even the Star Wars games where it's got their own dice, and you make the dice roll, and it's got all the different results, and you might get a success with a triumph, or a success with or you might get a fail with a triumph, which means that you get a success or a fail, but something might happen as a result. You might get some advantage, some unseen advantage. For example, I think the classic example is like, if you're there in front of a chasm, and you want to jump over the chasm. Fair one. You make the roll, and you might succeed. Cool, you get over there. You might fail. Oh no, you fall down a chasm, I guess you're dead. Cool. But you could make the roll, and I've succeeded with a triumph. Excellent. You get over there, and for some reason, maybe you've made it easier for your friends. Maybe when you get over there, you see, there's a board of wood, and I can just put it over, and now I've solved this little puzzle that's right in front of me. But you might get a success with a setback of some kind, or a threat, I think it is in the Star Wars game. And how that would work is, so you succeed, you jump over the chasm, but maybe as you leave that side of the chasm, or maybe when you get to this side, you feel the ground crumble underneath you, and makes the gap bigger. So now, anyone behind you that has to follow you has a harder time of actually making it. Sorry about that. So I think that's really interesting for a mechanic, and it kind of happens in Blaster with these 2 dice. If the skill die is higher than the actual ability die, then you get a perk, which means you get to do the exact same thing. I succeed or fail, but I might get a perk or a setback to change the story. And of course, crits happen when you roll the same result on both dice, as opposed to getting a 20 or a 1, that kind of thing. Crits happen when you roll the same result. So even if you roll a d6 and you got a 6 and you got a 6 on the d12, that means it's a crit. However, it depends on whether you succeed or fail. If your difficulty that you're trying to beat is 18, for example, and you have a d12 and a d6, you roll a 6 on both, that's a crit. But you did fail the roll, which means it's a crit fail as opposed to a crit success. So I like how that mechanic works together, and how mathematically it all works together, and with just dice that you have to yourself, you don't need to buy the Star Wars brand ones and then buy more and more and more of them till you have a big bundle of them to play the game once. You can use the dice that you have already and have a very similar experience with success, fail, but also changing the story where the GM can actually apply modifiers to the situation. You don't just succeed or fail. You don't just sneak past the guards. You might kick over a can. You get passed into the other room, but now the guards are more alert. That kind of thing. There's a lot of storytelling potential that the GM can unleash with that kind of mechanics. Let's have a look. Oh yeah, the next one is completely different. There's no dice involved at all. It's a game that I sort of made, and I don't know why I thought of it, but I thought, right, okay, this mechanic is really cool, but I think a direction I want to go in is a game that I'll call Odd Jobs, or Odd Jobs, just, yeah, however you want to say it. And the reason I called it that is because I thought, a really good name for a fantasy game would be something called, I don't know, Quest. However, there is a game already called Quest, and it's fantastic, and I will be mentioning it later. But Odd Jobs is great. Why am I saying that? Odd Jobs was really fun. I mean, I'm already reviewing it before it's come out. It was really fun to design, and it's really fun to play because it uses cards as opposed to dice. And the whole mechanic works along the idea that your sheet has sort of a standard array-esque 4 scores, and let's say you have a really strong character, and their strength or whatever it is 7, their agility is 5, their mind is 3, and their will is 10, not 10, 6, whatever. And you want to make a strength roll, or a strength draw, I suppose, with the cards. What you would do is, you then draw the card, and then you check, is it underneath my strength of 7? Oh, I drawn the cards and I got a 4. That's cool. That means I succeeded. Great. You've got a success on that draw. Not only do the cards have results, because they go from the ace, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 10, then it goes the knave, queen, and king, not only do you have that spread, you also have the 4 suits, which means each of your stats also has one of the suits next to it. Your strength might have heart or clubs, you get to choose this in character creation, but as a result, you can draw a card and be like, oh cool, I succeeded. But because my strength has a heart on it, and I've just drawn the 4 of hearts, not only do I succeed, it's a crit success. And this sort of simple, just draw a card, sort of story building, very simple mechanics so you can build the story, you and the GM together. I love that sort of thing. I think it's really, it's very fun that it replaces dice in a very fun, but also very kind of wacky mechanical way. And the whole game, if you couldn't tell by the title, the fact it's called Odd Jobs, is kind of intentionally trying to be funny, which might be a challenge for me. I might type out a big thing and be like, there we go. I try to make everything all funny and comical, and it's not going to make your belly laugh by any means. It's a set of rules after all, but it'll have some fun, farcical nature to it, and some people might be bored of it, or just be penance and not have any humour at all. That's absolutely a possibility. But the mechanics themselves, I think, are quite fun as a very basic Mork Borg-esque, just make a single draw, I succeed, fail, blah blah blah. I mean, there's also the extra thing in Odd Jobs where it's like, oh yeah, not only do you succeed, fail, but crit depending on whether you have the same suit. There's also the thing where I tried to implement, if you draw one of the royal suits, not royal cards, sorry, so the knave, the queen, and the king of any suit, they have their own special rules. I think for like the queen, if you draw a card, you have to make another draw, and if you draw a card that is the same suit as the queen, then you succeed, otherwise it's a fail, which means it's very bad. The king is reversed, and the jack has some really weird rule, and also jokers, because they don't have any numbers, they only have suits, black or red. You then draw them, and if it's the same, which is a 50-50 chance, then it's a crit fail, so jokers are very critty, and there's a lot of the mechanics that are built to be sort of like wacky, and lots of crits and lots of fails, and I think it's very fun to play when I've sort of ran any small play tests, and the characters as a result were really funny. What else have we got here? Ashfall. Now, Ashfall is a game that has, and the reason it's called Ashfall as opposed to something like Blaster, which is kind of just general sci-fi, and Odd Jobs, which is sort of a funny quest analogue. Ashfall, the reason it's called Ashfall is because there's a whole setting behind it, and that whole setting is based around the idea of ecological collapse. I don't know why I felt so driven to make that as a setting, but it is built on ecological collapse, the idea that humanity and the fantasy peoples, they went too far with technology and magic, or magical tech, whatever you want to call it, and as a result, they've polluted the world, and the world itself has literally fought back. Gaia, the spirits, all the things of nature have fought back, elementals everywhere, rife and causing huge devastation, and that's kind of that's the apocalypse level scenario, which sort of springboards a lot of fantasy games, you know. Why there's dungeons, and why there's all these fallen empires that you can stumble across in these fantasy games that we usually play. That's this sort of apocalyptic scenario. And Ashfall is a mechanic that I've went into briefly in another game, where I talked about how this sort of mechanic was good when I tried to make a very simple horror game for my friends to play. And the way it works is, by standard, when you want to make a roll, you have to pick up a d10. No? You have to pick up a d12, and a d6. And the reason you have to do that is because it's a fantasy game. It's one, as I say, ecological collapse, and the dice mechanic is built in a way so that there's no stats that affect your rolls really. There's like light modifiers here or there, but when you want to do anything, you pick up these dice and you roll them. If the d12 is higher than the result of the d6, which, when you look at these two dice, this one's double the result of that one, so that's going to be pretty likely, then that means you succeed. But the reason I've chose those dice in particular is because, again, as I always try to find some weird way to make the mechanics a bit different, if you have advantage, or if you have some, whatever I think I call it a boon again, if you have an advantage, that means the dice that you roll as like the skill or the action die, which is a d12, it increases to a d20, which gives you a much better chance. However, if you have some form of setback on your roll, that means you roll a d10, which is one step lower than a d12, against your d6, which I think you'll notice there, a d12 goes up to a d20, but if it goes down to a d10, which means that it's a lot more forgiving. If you get bonuses, it's great, and if you get setbacks, oh, it's a bit challenging. But also, speaking of challenge, the D6 is the challenge. The D6 is what the GM says, this sounds, about medium difficult, we'll give it a D6. If it's incredibly easy, roll a D4. That means now I have a D12 or a D10 or a D20 against a D4. That's going to be way easier to do. And then if it's harder, if it's a hard task, you roll a D8 against whatever dice you're rolling, D12, D10, D20, which means it's a, bit harder to do. And how this is also implemented into the mechanics of combat is that when it comes to things like making an attack roll, the weapons themselves have these difficulty die. So, if you have the D12 as normal, you don't have any advantage against this creature, you might have a weapon like a normal sword, which means you have a D6 and a D12. You roll them, oh look, I got a 12 and a 3, which means with the D12, I pass and I succeed, and I think that's actually a crit as well. So yeah, that would be a crit success, and with the D6, I got a 3, which means I deal 3 damage. The attack roll and the damage roll was all in one. Perfect. Also, I didn't mention yet, in Blaster, it's the exact same thing. When you make an attack roll, those 2 dice you roll, the skill die is your damage, which means it could be a D6 to a D12, and it's not allocated to the weapon you use, it's allocated to just how good you are at that kind of thing. You might have a really bad blaster score, but a really good melee weapon score, which means you have a D12 in that, but every gun you wield, you only roll with a D6. You might think that, what? Weapons have different ways they hurt, and I've seen people have that approach before. And I'll get back to Ashfall, it's the exact same thing with that. There are people that think, like, no, weapons have, they have different qualities that make them more dangerous than other ones. For example, the common knife isn't going to be as damaging as like a flail or something like that. I don't know. I'm not a weapons expert, but when it comes to the mechanics of those 2 things, you can see that this one rolls against the different kinds of damage difficulties, a D8, D6, and a D4. Meanwhile, Blaster relies on your skills specifically, which I think they're both completely valid. I think the first iteration of Sanctum, it was going to be completely based on just whatever your dice roll was. So every weapon was like Blaster, where you pick it up and it depends on how good you are, and there might be some bonus to the damage roll as opposed to the damage allocated to the weapon. Like D&D, Daggerheart, Pathfinder, Dragonbane, all these games have weapons that have a certain type of damage that they deal. Meanwhile, Blaster goes against that grain. And Ashfall is much more simple. There's only 3 damage types, D4, D6, D8. And you'll also notice, because they have different damage dice sizes, and you can roll lower than the D6 with the D12, that means that the weapons themselves, the one that has a D8, the one that deals the most damage, is actually harder to succeed with, because you might get up to an 8, which is great, I did 8 damage, but that means you have to try and beat an 8 with the other dice. And if you have a setback, you have a D10 and a D8, which means you might be failing a lot more because you've got this big unwieldy, but when you do hit, it hits hard sort of weapon. Meanwhile, we can have this idea that something like a dagger is much more quick and nimble and easy to use, and you're more likely to land a strike even if it's not that damaging a strike, because people wear armor, meaning you have a D12 versus a D4, which means you're probably going to hit most of the time with that D4, but when you do, it's just a D4. It's not hitting as hard as a D6 or a D8. I like that mechanic a lot, and it also happens with the armor as well. When it comes to you making an armor roll, you have to do the exact same thing. You roll your action dice versus whatever armor you have. If it's light armor, it's a D4. If it's medium, D6, and heavy has a D8. So the heavy weapons and armor, D8, scaling all the way down to a D4 with a light, and D4 for the weapons, that kind of thing. I like that mechanic also, and I think the last one that I wanted to mention was just, I've written down that I also considered the idea of a D6 dice pool. But there's a lot of games that do that, like the Alien RPG does that, and it's great, it's excellent, but it's, I kind of decided it and thought, okay, these other ones are much better than this one, I think. But that does lead me to the thought that I wanted to talk about today, and that is how, of course, I want mechanics to be much more interesting in the games that we buy. I really wish that, all these games that we see now, they have an approach for making an interesting game, rather than how can I make a game that people will really want to buy because of its similarity to things we already have, which is just, it sounds cynical, but it's just holistically true. Like, not to throw shade, the MCDM game that's coming out, I think it's called Draw Steel, that is a game, it's like, oh, it's a fantasy game. Matt Colville crying in his video saying, like, this is what I've wanted to do since I was 16, and that's amazing to hear. It's amazing that, like, he's finally getting to make his own game. It's so good. However, it is a fantasy combat game that people, and very unfairly, might I add, it's horrible when you hear people say this, but people were comparing it to 4th edition. And people were calling it, like, 4.5, which, again, very, I don't like it when people say that. I hate it when people say it to me when I come up with a new mechanic and someone's like, that's just this. And I'm like, shut up. So I don't like saying it about Matt, but again, very similar. And also, as well, I have to mention this as well, we're talking about dice mechanics. The first dice mechanics sort of iteration that they had, because I was on the Patreon for a while, the first iteration of the dice roll that they had was everyone rolls 2d6 for whatever they roll. They roll 2d6, which gives you like a bell curve, which I've mentioned in another video before. When someone mentions the word bell curve, suddenly they think you're some sort of messiah of maths, but it's a bell curve, 2d6, and I thought that's very fun. That's kind of like Powered by the Apocalypse games. However, they then went, actually, we've made a slight tweak. It's now 2d10. Very similar to the d20. Very similar to the d20. So, okay, I guess we're going very similar to the thing that we're trying to make a game to sort of compete with in terms of polish and quality. But to contrast that, we have other games that are absolutely full of interesting mechanics. I think the one that's kind of on my mind predominantly right now, just because it's kind of came out, is Daggerheart. When they talked about the fact that the way the dice rolls work is that you roll 2d12, and you roll them, and one of them is your bad dice, and the other one is your nice dice, and when you roll your nice dice, and it's higher than your bad dice, then everything's all good, and you don't get a fear. You might get a hope. I can't remember how the mechanics work. Anyway, but you have these dice, and you roll them against each other. And I remember when I first saw that, I was like, I hate this. I'm sorry, Matt, Darrington Press, when that first came out, I was like, I hate it, because why are you making me buy 2 sets of dice? And then, like, it requires me to have 2 sets of dice and roll them against each other and remember which one's the bad dice and the good dice. And that's, like, the tiniest thing to mention. And again, this is a past tense thing, because now, when I look at it, I'm like, oh my god, it's something different. They actually moved with this idea and had this central idea, and when you look at the rest of the game as a whole to complement the 2D12 thing, excellent. A star. Very good work, very good work. Also, great merch idea when they released this sort of like the dice that you can get for Daggerheart, and it's just the normal set, like the 7 is the normal set of dice. However, there's 2d12s in there, and one of them is a different colour to the rest of the dice to sort of imply that one's the bad dice, that one's the naughty dice that we have in our game when we roll the 2d12s together, which, I think the first time I picked up Daggerheart, it was like, it was that sort of core or beta rules thing that they released that was like 300 pages long. It was like, hang on, this is the beta, this is the sort of like alpha test and play test thing, and it's this jam-packed with content. You guys are insane. Also, love it. Very, very cool that they were able to do that with their massive team and all the money that they can put into it. The core rule book is out, and again, all these mechanics, for example, the thresholds, as opposed to just straight 1-for-1 health, the idea of your armor having these little slots that you tick down to help reduce more damage, I think is quite fun. The 2d12 thing, as I mentioned, the sort of meta currency, that is the hope and fear mechanic, that is a lot of people's bag. They really like their sort of hope and fear meta currency thing. I'm typically less inclined to enjoy a game that has a meta currency in it. Like, there's a couple of games that I've saw that has a meta currency, and for some reason it always draws me out to just know that I've got this little coin, this little coin next to me that I can just spend, and I can apply it to here. I know it's very similar to the likes of Mark Borg's Omens, which again, I don't have to think that game's perfect, despite how much I like Mark Borg, but yeah, it has a meta currency in, but some games are much more reliant on it, and maybe it's changed now because I don't have the book with me, but the first iteration of that hope and fear mechanic, a lot of people were like, God, you're constantly just adjusting that score up and down. You're constantly going, oh, there's like a plus here, like I've got fear and hope here, and it just got exhausting after a while. But I'm not here to slag Daggerheart. I think it looks fantastic. Art's fantastic. Game looks fantastic. 276 cards or whatever it was. Insane. Story focus, which I feel like we need a lot more of now. I remember I was going to make a joke about Daggerheart where I was going to say, now let's talk about my favourite game that is story focused, fantasy, and involves cards in your character creation. Quest. I said I was going to mention Quest again. Quest is a game that when it comes to like interesting mechanics, how I've talked about since the very beginning of this video, rolling a d20 and that being the sort of base, and that's the sort of can we get away from the d20 thing? Quest only uses a d20. It doesn't use any of the other dice, and it only uses a d20. You might think, how can it do that? Well, if you've ever played Powered by the Apocalypse games where they roll 2d6, it's very similar to that. You roll the d20, and it has a scale, a little box that shows the success and fail of that sort of roll. And I think the usual way that it goes is 1 to 10 is a fail, but then like in increments, in like 4 different spaces, as opposed to Powered by the Apocalypse where it's just fail, success, or fail with a setback. In this, there's just fail in a big block, and then different ways of succeeding afterwards, which is incredibly fun. It means that every attack roll is a d20, and you get 1 to 10 is your miss, but then like the amount of damage or the effects that you can apply on the enemy goes up. As I said, there's cards in it. It's very interesting in terms of mechanics. I think it's incredibly interesting that this game was like, fantasy game. What games do we know that's fantasy? D&D's got a d20 in it. What if it was just a d20? It's almost a game that is antithetical to my idea of like, can we get away from the d20? Because it's only a d20. And despite that, incredibly interesting. I think it's incredibly interesting that it went for this fake out idea of it's only the d20. You've all got a d20 and forget the other dice. It's just that. So I think Quest is really fun for that mechanic. What other games do I think that should deserve a shout out for sort of like interesting mechanics? I'm sure I'm going to post this, and I highly encourage anyone that's got any ideas or like what is a much more interesting mechanic that they've seen in recent games, big or small. I'd love to hear any indie projects, even bigger projects, and you find the mechanics of the actual dice mechanics are just really interesting to explore and use. I'd love to know more, because of course I don't know every game. I know a lot of games, but not every single game. I'd love to know even more. And if you didn't know about Quest, I suggest you go check it out, because it's completely free. You can get it completely free. I picked it up, and the whole thing has art. It's usually black and white. In terms of like text, I don't mean like the art is black and white. The text is just white and then black text, so it's very easy, very readable, and it's very set out very nice. It's very chill, laid back, story focused, very nice. You can check it out. And I guess the last thing I want to talk about, I guess the finale of the video, is that alongside all these games that I've sat and made, I've made like Sanctum and Blaster and Odd Jobs and Ashfall, these different things, and I thought these have potential. These have real potential. One that I've made recently and inspired me to sort of make this video talking about games that I've made and design, and how I think the design of games is crucial, and why I really strive for an interesting sort of mechanic. I'm in love with what I've made as of recently. It almost feels like every single time I go into a project, it's always a culmination of all these things I've tried, all these different like games that I've like experimented with and not enjoyed that one as much, but really enjoyed this one. It's almost become every game afterwards has become sort of a culmination of all that design coming to this new star child that comes out of it. And this game that I've made, that I've called Scepter, involves my action dice system, which I guess if I was to shorten it, Powered by the Apocalypse style, it would just be called like ADS. I don't know any other name for it. Yet the action dice mechanic is a mechanic that I've finally finalized, and it is a mechanic that I've wanted to implement in some form for a long time. Now, when I say a long time, I mean that if you look at Sanctum and the videos I've talked about it, it involves me talking about action points and how your character has 6 action points. And the reason that it's 6 as opposed to 3 if you've looked at the likes of Nimble 5e, that has 3 action points, which means you can take 3 actions. The reason it's 6 instead, you can't take 6 actions unless they're really quick actions. Each action normally takes 2 action points. But there are things in the game that cause you to either do so cheaper, regain an action point mid-turn, or they might make them more expensive so you can take actions less, and the action might cost actually 3 as a result. So there's all these things that make it so that there's a reason it's 6, but the reason that was there is because I hadn't quite landed on this idea, which was, how do I implement a dice mechanic that has actions that you take inside combat and outside combat, and they're reliant on the simple use of these dice, no mods and blah, blah, all that kind of stuff, and like big math, all that's skipped. How do I make it simple? How do I make it so that the actions that you take carry risk, as I mentioned before? How do I have it so that players can choose what they want to do? And it's all culminated in the action dice. So, let me explain how it works. The action dice system, when you're outside of combat, you're sat there with your character sheet with your friends and the GM, and on your character sheet are 4 dice. 4 very familiar dice, as we've seen in Sanctum. Your D12, your D10, your D8, and your D6, laid out in front of you. Now, when you want to do anything in this game, you don't go, right, reach for the D20, or reach for another dice in the box. You look down at the 4 dice that you have accrued, the D12, D10, D8, D6, and now it's a time for a choice. Which dice are you going to roll? Which dice should I roll, Ellis? Well, so, the reason that you're going to have to choose what dice you're going to roll is because you're trying to beat, normally, a 5. Similar to Sanctum. You have to roll a 5 or higher to succeed. That's for if it's an easy success, a very common type of skill difficulty for a roll. You can get medium, hard, and extreme still, like Sanctum, but I thought that, as just to explain, you're trying to get a 5 or higher. It's the same for attack rolls. If you're going to roll an attack roll, you try to get a 5 or higher. Now, you might be wondering, okay, if I'm trying to get a 5 or higher, then I'll just pick the highest dice. Go for it. But, when you pick that dice, you then can't use it again. That dice is gone. You use the D12, and now you can't use it anymore. Kind of. You can only use it when you've used all the rest of the dice. When you've used all 4, you then get them all back. Cool. Okay. So that means that instead of a D20, you have all these dice laid out. And what this means in practice, what this means when it comes to play is, okay, let's say, Grognar, whoever you are stood on the chasm, as we mentioned before. And as you're stood there in the chasm, you look down at the terrifying fall below. You only need to roll a 5 because you're a big athletic boy, and everyone else also has a 5. So, what dice are you going to roll? You then look down and go, well, if I'm trying to beat a 5, and it would be really bad if I died right here, I'll choose the D12, and let's roll it. I got an 8. Phew, thank God, I jumped the chasm, safe. However, that D12, that amazing D12 that I can keep, and that I'm probably going to succeed a lot of things if I keep that D12 around, it's gone now. Okay, so the next thing you need to do, oh no, there's monsters, we need to sneak past them. It'd be really bad if they noticed us and we're on low health. Well, I can't use the D12. I'll use the D10. Okay, let's roll that. I got an 8 again. Cool. Okay, succeeded. Nice. I only have a D8 and a D6 now. Okay. It's fine. We'll just carry on. Okay, next thing you need to do. Okay, so you are in front of a falling bridge, and it's going to fall unless you manage to catch it and keep it. Maybe it's an Indiana Jones moment. The door is going to crush down, and you need to stop it by holding it there. Okay, you can do that. Maybe on a 7, because that's a tough task. It's not an easy task. You're trying to hold a big weighted door down. That's going to be a 7. Well, I can't roll the 6 because I can't beat that. So I'll have to roll the D8, trying to get a 7 or 8. I got a 2, which means I fail. Great. Okay, so the door, you manage to hold it up, but you take some damage maybe, or whatever the GM wants to do is the setback, but you carry on. And then the last roll, I have a D6. This is pretty tough. I don't have any of my dice left. Okay. It's fine though. You are stood in front of a great sort of like trap door, or some sort of trap, some puzzle. And it says, say the word to enter. You look at your friends and go, what was the word? Can I remember what the word was? Yeah, you can make a remembrance roll, but since you heard of it last month, that'll be like a medium difficulty. So like try and roll the 7. I have a d6. That's a 3. Guess I failed. And then, after you've done that, you fail your roll, and you get all them back. Cool. You have your dice again. Now, why do I like this so much? Well, as I said before, it involves a level of risk. It involves choice. It involves this idea that the mechanics themselves, they're up to you. You get to decide, moment by moment basis, do I want to play conservatively and choose the d6 right away, take the chance, this task isn't that important, I'll roll the d6, try to get a 5, I got a 2, it's fine, I've still got the other ones there, when it really counts, I'll keep the d12 around. Or, do you really just want to succeed this right now? Maybe pride's on the line. Maybe it'd be really dangerous if you failed. So you could risk it with a d10, you might succeed. You really don't want to waste, really don't want to fail, so you pick up the d12. Oh, I got an 8 again. That d12's weighted. So I like that mechanic. And I said this to people before when I told them about this mechanic, and I said this is definitely going to lose some people. Some people are going to be like, what? I don't just roll the d20, and then it's just that every single time. And I understand. I've mentioned throughout the video that rolling the d20 sounds like just the bottom of the bin game design. It's not. There is love, there's reason behind the d20, and that's because it's one dice. Whenever you do anything, chances are you're going to roll this. Very easy to explain to a player. Hey, I want to make this roll, what do? Pick up that dice again. Same thing. It's always been a d20, unless you're rolling a hit dice, I guess, for some reason. So, while it's very simple, I love this mechanic that involves choice. I love this mechanic that allows the players, in just the actions they take outside of combat, to use the dice. And you have to play with the risk. The risk is in the rolls now. It's not just the fatigue now. It's not just the hit points now. It's not just the use of your abilities, how quiet you are, how stealthy you are. It's now down to the dice, and you have to choose them correctly. I like this a lot. You can probably tell. Some people will, some people won't, but if you don't, then that's fine. Not everything is for everyone. And another key component of this as well is that I've actually implemented modifiers. I've implemented very simple modifiers. Everyone, when it comes to character creation, they get to put either a +2, +1, +0, or -1. They get to put it in their, off the top of my head, their might, agility, mind, brawn? Brawn. In their brawn, agility, mind, and will. And you get to choose. Am I a big strong boy? That's a +2. Am I agile? +1. Am I not very smart at all? -1. And what it means is, when you pick up these dice, you're not just rolling a d12 trying to beat a 5. You might be really strong. It's a d12 +2. That's another 8. That's a 10. That d12. Okay, yeah. So that's another... Yep. I can't believe that it got another 8. Anyway, so you have your modifiers to help you along, which means that when they said, hey, you have to roll the 7... that's pretty hard, especially since I only have a d6 left, but it is in my favourite skill of my brawn, which means I get a +2. So d6 +2, I got a 4. There we go. I got a 6. Damn, still a fail. But you get the idea. You get the idea that you can have some leeway, and it also means that if you have something like an easy roll and you only have a d6 left and you have a -1 in that roll, you can only succeed. You can still succeed by getting a 6, but you can only succeed by getting a 6. It's no longer a d6 +0, 1, or 2. It's now a d6 -1. So I love the modifiers. There's no skills, but you can get something akin to it if you take a feature. The features will be something along the lines of you get a +1 when you do this, this, or this. Like, for example, a stealthy one would be like you get a +1 when you're trying to hide, or another one would be when you're trying to pick locks and blah, blah, that kind of thing. Nimble Fingers might be the name of the feature. So you don't get skills, you just have the 4 stats, which a lot of games do. That's not abnormal for games to not have skills, but I do like the idea of it's just the 4 things and your 4 dice and your 4 modifiers, and how you use them is entirely up to you. And then when it comes to combat, That's when I'm in love with this system. So, when it comes to the dice, it's exactly the same. If you've had all your dice and you've used some, they all refresh at the start of combat. Cool. Great. I have all my dice back. I have my beloved D12 ready to use. And they refresh every turn. Great. I don't just have to sit there and throughout the entire combat worry like, oh god, I've used all my dice. Nope. At the start of combat, each turn, you get all 4 of your dice to play with. Great. But now comes a choice. The way that movement works in this game is you have to consider which dice you're going to pick. And as opposed to your character just having like 30 feet flat, or like 35 feet if you're a wood elf, that kind of thing, instead of your character having flat movement, chances are you're going to be able to move 30 feet. Because if you just spend this turn, the d6, you can move a number of feet equal to 5 times the highest result on a dice. So, pick a d6, I can move 30 feet. Great. I can, every turn, this useless little d6, I can just keep it around and use it as my movement. Or, if you really want to sprint at the target, you're like, nah, come here. You can roll that, you can use the d12, and you move 12 times 5, 60. Or, again, if you're on grids, you can explain to your players, not feet, but squares. You can move a number of squares equal to the maximum result. You can move 12 if you have a d12. You can move 6 if you have a d6. That kind of thing. So that's how movement works. Very simple. There are some things that allow you to add your agility, and some of them adding your might to the actual the number itself. So if it's a d6 but you have a +2, you can move an 8. If it's a d12 and you have a +2, you can move 14. You can move 14 feet. No, 14 squares. So you're in a turn. So that's how movement works. Very simple. It does mean that you have to consider what dice you use again, which, of course, I'm a big fan of. And your characters are typically, as a result, a lot more mobile, because the lowest thing they can get is a d6. Unless you get a Bane. If you have a Bane on the roll, just like Sanctum, the dice increase or decrease. So, if you have a d6, it turns into a d4, meaning if you have an affliction such as you're dazed, which means you have a Bane on agility rolls, well, agility is kind of linked to movement, so, oh no, this d6 instead becomes a d4, which means if I spend the d6, I'm only going to be able to move 20 feet, but I really want to move further, so I'm going to have to use a d8, which I was hoping to spend on something else, or if it's really far away, I might need to use the d10 or the d12, and they scale back into d10s and d8, sorry. But the same happens with the other way. If you have a boon, you might get to roll the d20 for your movement and just beeline into the sunset. Who knows? You might spend literally all of your dice on a turn on movement, which would be d8, d12, so 20, and then 16. You might move 36 squares in a turn if you wanted to by just spending all the dice. But that would be a whole turn wasted. What else can you do apart from movement? Well, you can also make attack rolls. Slow down, cowboy. Fantasy game with swords and spells. You want to use attack rolls? You silly bastard. Well, if you want to make an attack roll, it's very similar to Sanctum. You have to roll the dice, add your modifier, and try to get a 5. So, if you have something that you're really good at, for example, you're a brawler, which means you have fist fighting. You're a barbarian. Oh no, sorry, you're a berserker, which means you have your big heavy weapons. You have something like the fighter. So, whatever weapon you're wielding, you're typically going to focus your stats on using the weapons that you enjoy using or are good at using. So, you pick up the d12, add your modifier, and you're probably going to be hitting, if you have, a result of 5 to roll, you're probably going to hit. And that's by design. I could get into all of that. I could get in the real granular aspect of why it's kind of important that you hit every turn, because the monsters always hit unless they roll a 1, so the game is geared towards your rolls kind of nearly always hitting unless something goes really bad, which might ask the question of like, well, why don't you just hit anywhere? It's because of certain things that you'd have to read the whole rules, which eventually will come out, I hope, to understand. But yeah, just take my word for it that it's there is method behind the madness. But actions. If you want to make an attack roll, as I said, pick a dice, add the modifier, roll a 5, you hit. And depending on what dice you roll, this might affect how high of the damage you deal, because similar to Sanctum, the weapons have a base damage. So a dagger is 1 damage, a great sword is 3, which is like the biggest, and something like a battle axe is 2. So you can have 1, 2, or 3, and if you roll a 5, that's an easy hit, you deal the weapon's damage. If you roll a 7, that's a medium hit, which means you deal 1 more damage. So a dagger, you deal 2 now. A hard hit, you deal 3 because you get a +2 bonus on the weapon's damage. And an extreme hit, which is, again, quite easy to do. Well, not easy, but quite capable to do if you have a d20, which might happen if you get if you get a boon on the attack roll, that d12 can turn into a d20, which means that your chance of getting an 11 is very easy on a d12. It's much easier, on a d20. So if you get those results of like higher up the scale, not just 5, that means you get more damage. So easy peasy. Action rolls work like that. What else have we got? I want to run down things like classes and abilities that they get, because I decided to go with classes in this one. But before that, I thought I would mention something that I'm very excited about, and that is spells. And now, anyone that knows me saying very excited about spells will probably surprise them, because when it has come to the designing of these games, every time I even touch magic, I have a massive sort of like mental shutdown. Not because I think like it's like, I just don't have the creativity for it. I mean that I'm so driven to make sure that it's right and unique. But really, as I've explained in previous videos, that is so hard to do. It's so hard to make a unique system for spellcasting, because when I say that, you either have spells systems that is like, right, a list of spells. Even simple games like Mouse Ritter has a list of spells in your little obsidian cubes that you carry about. D&D and Pathfinder obviously has your list of spells and that kind of thing. Even Dragonbane has your list of spells. Then you have other games like Vagabond, for example. There's the Broken Empires, I think, which has the sort of like you make your own spells sort of system, which is very fun, but it can, as many people have pointed out, and I agree with, it can result in your turns as a spellcaster taking a longer time, because you have to then sit there and go, right, let's choose its range, its shape, what the spell does, any modifiers, any of these things I'm going to spend extra mana on to change the spell. It can make it so that the people who are just punching or slashing with a sword go, right, that's my turn, and then it goes up to the wizard who's like, right, cracks their knuckles and then starts going, let's get into this, and then all the numbers start to crack out, and it takes ages while everyone else is sat waiting for them to take their turn. So, spells in this, how do they work? Well, first of all, the spells are in a list. There are a list of spells, but the list of spells, they're pretty generic by design. If you sit there and go, why would you design them to be generic spells? I mean, for example, there is one that's like a fireball, a lightning bolt, so there's those kind of damaging spells, and there's stuff like the spell where you point at someone and they're stuck frozen, the spell where you point at something and it transforms, all these kind of typical fantasy things, except, there's no things like D&D where it's like whole person, you choose one person, but it can increase to other people, or I guess like mass whole person, or whatever it's called, like mass suggestion, as opposed to suggestion, the two different spells, one of them affects more people, one of them affects one. There's not that level of like split hairs to it. It's just the spell that makes someone stand still and the spell that damages someone in a ball. But that's because the spells in this system, I love, you take the spell as its base and then you start adding modifiers, which is sounding like it's going to take longer. However, the modifiers are super fun to implement, and the way that it's implemented involves the dice. So, by base, most of these spells will have a range of 60 feet. That's just the way that a lot of them works. I like the idea that spells as a base do have quite a close range. Like 60 feet isn't that big, especially since the base sort of range for D&D cantrips is like 120 feet, like Firebolt and Eldritch Blast. So the fact that the base sort of range for all spells is 60 feet means that spellcasters kind of have to get dangerously close to the people that might be angry that they've had a spell cast on them, or have the spell blow up in their own faces, which I like by design and world building wise, that spellcasters are kind of these mad bastards who utilize magic that is very likely to hurt them or sort of spring back on them. And the spells, you choose this base spell, you add the modifier. So the modifiers might be things like, I increase the range by 60 feet, so now it's even longer. Another one might be, I affect another target, which is very fun to use, especially since you have the spell that's like, oh, I make someone stand still. Now you choose a second person. Maybe you have the ones that transform someone into a chair, that kind of thing. All these different spells. And what you can do, though, is you go, right, spell that does that. Increase range. Another target. If it's a damaging one, increase damage. If it's a damaging one, it's like fireball, I'm going to choose this one, which lets me change the damage type into a different damage type. Now I can make it a lightning ball, or a thunderball, that kind of thing. Thunderbolt. So you can adjust the spells and modify them and have this creative control over the utilization of the spells, and how they come back to using the dice is like this. So, a lot of the things in Sanctum need a 5+. The spells are exactly the same. When you want to cast a spell, you have to choose which dice you're going to roll. Let's say you really want the spell to get off. For example, it's a sort of spell that says, you sit there and don't move, so our fighter can come in and punch you in the head. I'm going to roll the d12. But he's very far away, so I want to increase the range. So, for the same casting of the spell, you then have to pick up another dice. And just hold it in your hand for now. You might go, okay, he's very far away, but I also want to choose another target. I'll choose another dice. So, I've just picked up the d12, the d10, and the d8. Because I'm now going to roll them, and on every single dice, every single one, I'm hoping for a 5+. Well, I've got a 9, a 7, and a 1. Now, not only is a 1 bad, because now it means that I take damage equal to all the dice I rolled, so I take 3 damage. Which, ouch, my wizard bones are hurting now. But also, since I rolled a 1, I then get a backfire table, which is not good, because I might have something horrendous happen to me midway through casting a spell. But also, because you have 4 dice, if you wanted to, as a spellcaster, you could, if you wanted to, just go, right, actually, I'm going to spend every single dice to make the spell incredibly potent and powerful, increase all the range, all the targets, and then roll all the dice, roll them all together, and try and get a 5+ on every single one, and look at that, I got another 1, I got a 2 and a 3, so that's definitely a fail, and a backfire, and I take 4 damage. So, it involves not only this idea of customizing spells in a very simple way, but it also asks you to consider these dice, and how you're going to roll them, because you might go, I really want the spell to go off, I'll choose a d12, but if I want to make it any better, I need to pick another dice. I only have lesser dice, like d10s and d8s, and what if I want to spend the d8 or the d10 to get out of dodge because I'm very close to an enemy? Then I'm going to have to choose a lower dice like a d6, I'm definitely not going to get a 5+, I just got a 4. So it's that choice, that risk mechanic that is implemented into the spellcasting in a very fun way. You're sat there as a spellcaster going, I now roll the bones, like, and then, no, I got 3 and a 4. Yeah, so that's a really fun mechanic of, yes, I'm now going to cast a spell and risk utter doom to unleash its full potential, which is really fun. Now that I've talked about spells and actions and movement and that kind of thing, I wanted to address the more player-focused things, or at least the things that people are genuinely quite excited about, and that is character creation. So, of course, the very simple character creation of choosing your modifier, which of course is just a +2, +1, +0, or -1, and you can put it in any of your 4 stats. And these don't affect the dice you roll, you choose which dice you're going to roll. And the other things is, of course, your equipment and your proficiencies, that kind of things, which I won't go into in this video, because I feel like it's not important. We're talking about dice mechanics. But what is very important and very fun is the classes. And, you know, we're used to classes by this point. We're used to the 12, that's in D&D. We're used to more of them, that's in Pathfinder, that kind of thing. And originally, I was going to consider going classless again, which is something that I've done in not only Blaster and Sanctum, But also Ashfall, I was considering just making all those classless systems so there's complete choice, as opposed to picking a class that sort of pigeonholes you into a single sort of like fantasy. You can choose whatever character you want. However, that is a double-edged sword, because while one allows for creativity and complete control over what your character actually is and what abilities they have, you could choose them to have a really good weapon thing sort of ability, and then another one that's very spell-focused, and you can just choose them however you like. While that's really cool in Sanctum, and I definitely feel it has complete merit, it does fit the sort of people that want that specifically. Otherwise, there are a lot of people that really enjoy classes because they have a central fantasy baked into them. If you want to play the big meathead, you can pick up a barbarian. If you want to play the spellcaster healer guy, you can play a cleric. The sneaky boy, you can pick up the rogue. That kind of thing. And because they have these specific fantasies, some people would ask, okay, I've got all these. If I want anything minute or slight tweaked or change, I could maybe pick up a feat. I could maybe multi-class. Otherwise, these are sort of the generic, broad fantasies. If I want something specific and I complain that I want something specific, then it sounds like I'm asking for the developers to just make more specific classes. And how far do you go with that, really? Like, how many classes can you make before eventually you go, these are starting to cross over a lot? So with that in mind, I tried to make the classes, and I thought of a bunch of fantasies so far and a bunch of classes that I think would be very fun, very interesting to bring in. And speaking of Daggerheart that I mentioned before, I did also consider, like, do I go that route and, you know, trying to make it so that the players have some sort of physical prop, like a card, in order to record their character stuff on. But if I did that, then I'd have all the people saying, you're just copying Daggerheart, and I'd hate for that to be the thing. They spent a lot of work on that, and it is very interesting, the whole card thing. At first I thought it was odd, but that's just the thing with change. And initially I was going to do that. However, I did also land on this conclusion that if you do go with the idea that, yes, I have complete control, and as I go up I can pick all these cards to choose what my character's like, rather than just being pigeonholed into this central level up idea. While that's the case, your characters in Daggerheart never feel like a central fantasy. Very controversial take, yes. They do feel like a central fantasy, but think of it this way. The barbarian in D&D Pathfinder, that kind of thing, they have this central sort of line, which is, I am big buff boy, and I get slightly better, like with increments as I get up, until I become this just meat tank with loads of hit points and some abilities to help me sort of further that fantasy. Meanwhile, in Daggerheart, you might have, let's say, the rogue, and they have their two subclasses, and all the different cards, how they customize, but they're not really cards that sort of empower a specific idea of the rogue. What ends up happening is I'm a rogue with a lot of like weird offshoot abilities that don't necessarily have to or just match each other at all. Like, I have this one fighter ability that lets me do this specific thing, and then another one that's very different, and I can just mismatch them, and people like that sort of customization. It's almost like warlocks and how you can customize them, but at the same time, again, you have your class that doesn't feel like it's the same character, or at least the same sort of fantasy that carries on throughout the entire game. I don't know if that's incredibly opinionated or something that only I think of and people don't believe that at all, but, you know, it's something I've thought of, so I might as well bring it up. So classes in this game then. So we're talking about dice mechanics. We're talking about how we can use them to sort of make things interesting. Well, if I want to try and do things off the grain, do things a bit different, I start off with something like the Bard. The Bard is, of course, in the usual D&D Pathfinder thing, they're the people who have all the spells, supporty guys, music, poetry, that kind of thing, charisma. Well, I like the idea that bards don't have spells. They're just people with the guitar, and they are their support peoples just by being a force of presence in the battlefield. So they have no spells by basic. There is a speciality where they can get spells, but it's not as, you know, spell intensive as a wizard or sorcerer, that kind of thing. Instead, how do the dice mechanics come in? Well, they have an action called Inspiring Performance, and what they can do is they can choose any of the dice that they have to offer, the D12, the D10, whatever. They then roll it. I'll do it right now. D12. I rolled a 9. Very good. Now what this means is something very Very cool. When I roll this, anyone that starts their turn within 15 feet of me then can swap out one of their rolls with the result that I've just rolled. For example, if someone makes an attack roll and they miss, they might get a really bad miss. Maybe someone has cast a spell and they get a 1. Well, what they can do is they can lessen their failures by swapping out that roll with that 9 that I've just rolled, and I can just give it to you. So as opposed to going, right, here's your bardic inspiration, and you get a dice, and the dice depends on whatever level you are. Instead, you as the bard go, right, I'm going to see how much oomph I put into this performance. I really go for it and give it my all. Do I get to roll the d12, or do I have to make, maybe it's a song that everyone knows and we can all sing along, so I pick up the d12 and roll it. Oh, there we go, I got an 8. Cool. And you get to swap out one of your dice. It might be a block, it might be a dodge roll, it might be a movement. You might take the d6 and then just swap it with the d8, and now I'm moving 8 squares as opposed to 6. That kind of thing. You can swap it around, and it's incredibly useful, and it's a guy that doesn't have spells and then just stood there with a loot. Very interesting. I like that a lot, as opposed to what we're kind of used to. The other one that I want to bring up is, of course, the Berserker, which is the sort of word that I give for the big meat tank boy, more commonly referred to as stuff like the Barbarian or the Fury in the... I keep wanting to call it the MCDM RPG, but it's not. It's the Draw Steel, that's their name for it. So the Berserkers don't have armor, as you might expect. Big, greased up Conan the Barbarian with big weapons. That is the Berserker. And as opposed to going, hello, I'm the Berserker, I turn on my rage, instead of that, the way that it works is, instead, your character gets an ability called Building Rage. So, I love this mechanic a lot. So you've taken your turn, you've moved in, you've hit someone, cool. Maybe you stood right in front of the enemy, ready for them to hit you, you've got all the hit points, you can tank it. Well, when they hit you, you then pick out a d4. You then put it on your character sheet. Then, if throughout this whole turn, you keep getting hit, well, that d4, swap it with a d6. You get hit again, cool. It's a d8 now. And this keeps going up with a maximum of d12, which, if you've been hit enough to get up to a d12, you are probably hurting. You've took 5 hits, which is brutal, but, the reward is here, because what you can do is, you can then keep that dice that you've got up to a maximum of a d12, and when you have a roll, you can then add the dice that you've saved up onto the roll, or you can use it to just take the move action. So, you can use this dice, even if it's a d6, even if it's a d4, sorry, you could pick up this d6 that you've gained from just being hit twice off your turn, and that's your movement, allowing you to hit with all of the rest of your actions. It gives you an entire new action, basically, by using this ability, and it is all based on the idea that your rage builds. You don't just turn on your rage. You don't just turn on my berserk affliction. Nothing like that. Instead, as opposed to just, I am angry now, your character actually responds to being hit. And, you might think, okay, that's cool. It's not a detraction from like the Barbarian and D&D and stuff. That all makes sense. Your character just enters a state of being angry. They can push themselves spiritually. That all makes sense. It's all very fun. However, I like the idea that, pain drives the Berserker. And the reason I think that is because the rest of their abilities are based around the fact that if you take damage, something fun happens. More specifically, as you get to 4th level, you get an ability called Relentless, which means you suffer no setbacks to rolls or movement when you're dying. Now, when you're dying, of course, you're at 0 hit points. When you take damage, you gain a fatigue instead. And that's pretty bad. And during that state, you're, the Boromir fight scene, you're there, you're sluggish, your attack rolls don't land quite as good, you have a bane on them, oh, I'm sluggish, I can't quite move as far. Well, in that instance, when you're a berserker, you don't care. When you're dying, you're just fuel to continue. Everything works completely fine. And when you reach the final level of this class, when you reach 10th level, you gain a boon when you're dying. So when you're knocked down to the worst point in your day, that's when you hit the hardest. That's when you're pushed to the utter death and you become desperate and animalistic and furious. When you get to 7th level, you get an ability called Brutality, which says that while you're wounded or dying, weapon damage you deal can't be reduced. If an enemy has natural armor, like a big dragon, or even just something like a robot of some kind that has armor, or even just a person with armor, they can't reduce your damage. They can't block it. They can't reduce it with armor. You hit so hard when you are wounded that the blood frenzy within you just kicks off and you just hit and they can't reduce it. And then, of course, at 10th level, you get the ability that you got before, but it's just improved, but you also get Too Angry, which, of course, is shortened for Too Angry to Die, the whole Doom meme. And it says that you can't be enthralled or shaken, which basically means that you can't be scared in any way, or you can't be, like, charmed, you can't be beguiled by magic, because you're just too angry to care. So, that class not only has this sort of building rage mechanic, where it has this little dice to sort of modify your rolls and to change how your actions can go about. Not only do they have that, which can empower the actual resulting attack roll, resulting in more damage, hitting harder as a result from just being hit. Not only that, but it's a whole class built around how much hit points you actually have, because as I said before, there's not many instances in games where having full health and 1 health matters. If you're 1 HP, who cares? You can still hit exactly the same, but in this, if you're a berserker, when you get to wounded status, that is when you start ripping and tearing until it is done. And more specifically as well, if you choose the barbarian speciality, you get an ability called Ferocious, which says when you're wounded, another instance of your hit points being at half or lower, that means you get a boon on attack roll. No, sorry, I'll try again. I'll rewind. Ferocious means when your target is wounded, like a shark sniffing blood in the water, you get a boon against them. So, this is a class that actually, the more they are hurt, they get more bonuses, but the barbarian is more animalistic. They can charge someone down and go, are you hurt? Cool, I'll hurt you more. That kind of thing. So, I like how those two classes are very different. One supportive, one is entirely focused on themselves. I get hit, therefore I can hurt you more. But I like just that change. It's not just the usual, I turn on rage, or I give a bardic inspiration. I try to go for like something different, and I think it pays off, and it works specifically in this system. You can't really do the whole bardic thing for everyone, unless you like really try to implement it in another game. I like how it's implemented, and frankly, I've not seen it being done in anything else. So, the other class that I want to mention is the Brawler, and don't worry, I'm not going to go through every single class. But one of them is the Brawler, which is just your fist fighter. You don't need weapons, you don't need anything like that. You can just punch and you're absolutely fine. And this whole class is based around, of course, not needing anything, but the specialities, there is 3 complete specialities to choose from. Monk, Pugilist, and Street Fighter. And the 3 of them, they have their own specific fantasies. Monks allow you, whenever you hit someone, you can move around, which means your character is much more fast, and it also means that not only are you more quick because you can hit and move around, that also means that unintentionally, your character doesn't need to take the move action as much, which means they have remaining dice left over in order to hit people, which means inadvertently, from the fact that I can just take the movement action whenever I slap someone, even if I get a really bad kind of hit, I can move around and just use another dice I would have used on movement to hit them again. The Pugilist is more based around grabbing people, taking away actions from people. It's more about being strong and grabbing people and hurting them more if you're grabbing them, just punch them in the ground, making haymaker strikes against them. And of course, the Street Fighter is based around playing dirty, and it's based around also not only fist fighting, but picking up bricks and chairs and hitting people and being just as effective with hitting someone with a cup as you are with just punching them in the face. Spellcasters. The spellcasters are, of course, as I mentioned, they are beholden to how spells work. They choose spells, and none of the spellcasters ever have a restriction, really, on what spells they can take. If you are a wizard, even though you've played 5e, and you're like, oh no, I can't, as a wizard, I can't use healing spells. In this, if you're a spellcaster, you can use any spell. It's just that the class that you have determines a lot how you use them. Like the Scion. The Scion, I love psionics. I love telepathy and that kind of stuff. I think it's super interesting, even if some people think that it's kind of rooted in sci-fi, but I've just told you earlier that I love sci-fi, so of course I'm going to love it. When it comes to the Scion, they can get psionics, which means that their spells don't count as spells. They can't be affected by things that negate spells, and they don't need to use any components such as your chance and your motions and having a spell conduit to cast them through. You don't need a staff or a wand. You can just put your hand on your temple and just ooh, and the spell happens. Or, more fun, you can just walk into a room, look at something, and it sets on fire. Because you can just control things with your mind. In terms of how things affect the rolls, there's something I want to bring up in terms of spells. The Scion has an ability called Heightened Control. Now, spells, one thing I didn't mention, when I saved it till now, is that the duration of a spell is chosen by you. Normally, they last until your next turn, unless it's something like a fireball, then it just boom, happens. These sort of things will be specified. If you want to increase the duration, then you need to modify it. You need to spend one of your modifiers, which means you have to roll another dice, which is fine. We all know how that works. But when you want to keep the duration going, it's not like holding concentration in D&D where if I take damage I need to make a roll. I don't want that overhead over people. Instead, when you want to keep a spell going, you then just spend one of your dice. And you just take it. You don't need to make the roll. You just waste one of your dice, or use one of your dice. It could be the D6, which you might be fine with, in order to keep it going. When you have something like impeccable focus, you don't need to. The Scion doesn't need to use any components to cast a spell. They don't need to look like they're casting a spell in order for the spell to actually happen. And their spells don't count as spells. And impeccable focus means that they don't even need to spend a die to maintain it because they're just such a strong-minded boy. Then you have something like Heightened Control, which says that when you fail those dice I mentioned, if you don't roll a 5 or higher, then you normally have a fail. But when you have a Scion on the team doing this, they only take damage equal to the number of dice that you failed with. Not the entirety of the pool that you roll, just the ones that failed. So, you have the Scion who takes all these rules regarding how spellcasting works and breaks them in two. They can just modify them. They have mind over literal matter and the spells that affect it. They have utter control. And of course, at high levels, they can't be incapacitated, which means they're just so empowered that you can't even knock them unconscious because they'll just stay awake. So, a lot of flavour. And I love how the Scion, their whole thing is that they take spells and go, I'm not really a spellcaster. Let's just take these rules and put them over there. Anyway, and then just unleash utter mayhem on the battlefield, which is great to the idea of this almost alien-minded creature. There we go. One that I really want to mention is the Rogue. Now, the real reason I wanted to mention the Rogue is because, first of all, when we think of the core fantasy of a Rogue, we think of stealth, sneak attack, and they're a skill monkey. Okay, so let's start with the whole stealth thing. If you're stealthy, you're probably going to put agility as your high modifier. There's not an inherent thing in here which makes you just better at stealth. You can choose a speciality, the Thief or the Shadow, which makes you better at stealth. That's absolutely fine. But otherwise, you're a skill monkey. You're a guy that can sneak around. You're an expert. And the way that this is sort of given, the first level ability is called Skilled. So, this is one of these abilities that breaks the game and how the rules work again, which is, of course, my favourite part of designing, is breaking their own rules that I've written. So, when it comes to you playing a rogue, of course, in every other situation, everyone's rolling a d6, d8, d10, and d12. You, on the other hand, as a rogue, roll a d12, a d10, and 2 d8s, which means you can completely bypass ever needing to roll the d6 ever again. Unless you have a Bane, then it's a d6. So, this means that the worst parts of rolling, because you're such just a skill monkey boy, you can avoid the utter setbacks of all these rolls. You can more reliably succeed and more reliably get things like a 5+. The other ability is, of course, sneak attack. If we're moving away from the dice mechanics specifically, sneak attack, I wanted to make sure that these mechanics never got too complex. I didn't want people to go from I roll 1 dice to do an action to turn into I roll 1 dice in order to hit and then roll 1,000,000 dice and then have to do all the adding up. Instead, the way this works is, I mentioned this before, when you hit with a weapon, An easy hit is the damage of the weapon, and any degree of success afterwards is an additional 1 point. When you have a sneak attack, though, if you manage to get the drop on someone, you hit them with a boon, or there's someone who stood next to your target, well, that means that it's not +1, it's +2. So if you sneak attack and you get an extreme success with your hit, normally that would be the weapon's damage plus 1, 2, 3. Instead, it's the weapon's damage plus 2, 4, 6. And in terms of the damage in this game, having just a +6 on your roll in terms of the damage that you deal to someone is incredibly brutal. Some enemies in the game, you will just one-shot them. And that is the power of sneak attack. And it involved no more dice rolls. Again, simplicity, but potency. The ability overcome means that whenever you make a roll, you can remove one of the banes affecting it, which means that you don't need to have that issue affecting your roll. You can just get rid of them. So anytime that I said, oh, that D8 might turn back into a D6, if you only have one bane, no you don't, it's a D8 again. You can remove all the disadvantages. Well, one disadvantage that you have on that. The ability Deft at 7th level means that you can add your agility bonus to any roll. Now, before, it was +2, probably for agility because you're a rogue. Then you might have your +1, +0, or -1. With this, you can apply that +2 to anything. Anything. If you're incredibly dumb, if you're incredibly not strong, if you're incredibly not charismatic, that +2 is on every single roll now. So not only have I got 2d8 to d10, d12, everything I roll, I get a +2 to. Great. My chances of failing is much lower across the board. And this is, I think, the most simple iteration I've ever seen of a skill monkey, aka just someone who has so many ways to just be reliably roll and success every time. And of course, the 10th level 10th level ability, Fluke, stroke of luck. Not necessarily, yeah, I'm trying to think of another synonym for fluke. Lucky, jammy bastard. Anyway, it says, when you roll, I'll try again, you can turn a fail into an extreme success. And you can do that every time combat happens. So once you use it, you have to wait till combat happens again, and you can use it again. Which means that, if we go back to sneak attack, if you have a boon on someone, then you sneak up to them, you have a boon, you then hit them, and even if you fail, perfect, I make it an extreme success, and I deal my +6. So, I love these classes and how I've kind of designed them. The way they're all laid out as well, I've tried to make it so that their word count is very shrunk. So it's very simple mechanics and simple ways that you just read it and go, oh, okay, I get how it works. And to go into spell classes again, and how there's classes that can modify the rules. The Sorcerer. I've went with a kind of similar idea of the Sorcerer compared to other games where people have this idea that the Wizard is just more spells and more control over them. Meanwhile, the Sorcerer is kind of the antithesis to that. They don't have more spells. They might have even a smaller pool of them, but they're incredibly potent with them. So, as a result, you have the ability Inner Control, which says that you can choose 2 spell modifiers, which, again, we all love, and each time you cast a spell with one of these modifiers, you can apply one of them without using a die. So, you could pick up a dice, and be like, okay, I need to roll a 5+. Cool. I got a 12 on that d12. Excellent. But I also applied a modifier that is one of my modifiers that I've chosen. Maybe you think, I want to be like a sorcerer spell sniper, so I'm going to choose the increased range modifier. And on every single spell now, my range is permanently increased by 60 feet. Excellent. Which means every single spell, I'm just shooting people from far away. Great. Maybe one of your modifiers is the increase target roll, which is madness, which now means that you as the sorcerer can go, cool, I'm going to take the most horrific spell to cast on my enemy, and then choose the one that allows me to cast it on 2 people at once, and just have that for free without the risk of having to roll another dice and potentially fail. Excellent. It's just the control and having this sort of in your back pocket, this innate way that you can control spells and bend them to your will, and you can kind of flavor why that's the case, why your character is just able to modify the spell so that it always affects more people or is more potent in terms of damage. Or one that might be quite interesting is you get the modifier which says, well, every time I cast a spell that deals damage, I can change the damage type, which means now anytime you cast a spell that deals damage, you can just choose whatever the damage type is, and it doesn't affect your rolls at all. Fireball, nope, you can choose any damage and it doesn't matter what. I love that ability so much. I think it's very, very interesting. And also because they're sorcerers, little bonus in there, they can cast spells without trinkets. They don't need the wand or the staff because they can just use their body and they can just use their hands and the spell happens. Because they are just innately pumped with magic, they have arcane abjuration, which means that they take damage off the damage when they take damage from spells. So they have more damage reduction against spells passively. You cannot hurt me, I am spells. 7th level ability is Energy Burst, which works on the idea that when you do actually fail one of these rolls to cast a spell, the damage that you take, you also inflict on a target nearby. Someone within 60 feet, you're sharing this damage with me as well. When I say share, I mean you take the damage and they also take the same damage. So it means that you can just punish people for you failing. Isn't that what we all want in life? Which is, I like that ability a lot, because it plays with that idea of these rolls that we're all doing to cast spells. Already, as a base, I can choose one of these modifiers to make all of my spells just more powerful by basic, but I can still increase the potency of the spell again and again and again at the risk of failing. But even if I fail, yeah, I'm going to hurt myself, and I'm also going to really mess that guy up over there. So love that for a sorcerer. And of course, the last ability called Supreme, so you can be the Sorcerer Supreme and not the clothing brand. It says, each time you do the casting action, the dice is considered to be one size larger. So, whenever you do the casting of a spell, you could choose, okay, let's see. I only want to do this as like, I don't know. It's not that important. I'll just choose a D6. Oh no, sorry. It's a D8 now. Maybe you go, oh, okay, I want this to actually get off, so I'll use the D10. But I want to use this D12 for something else, so I'll use the D10, and it turns into a D12. And of course, the horrific one, you want to ensure the spell does not fail at all. So you go, okay then, I choose the D20, no, I choose the D12 and it becomes a D20 and I have to roll a 5 or higher. So, that means that you are able to just manipulate spells a lot more. You have more control over them as you dominate them and unleash them with greater potency upon your foes and find the ability to be able to even control that own chaos that you can unleash. So, as you can see, and I could dive into more, like the spell blade and how they can mix up their ability to use weapons and spells. The summoner, which passively can just have minions at their side. The wizard, which gets more spells, and they get like a lot more spells, to be honest. Like everyone gets like a spell basically like every 2 levels. So a number at first, and then like +1 at 3, then 5. But meanwhile, the wizard gets 1 for every level. So they have just loads of spells by the end. That kind of thing. They have Spell Savant, Master Caster, other abilities like that to sort of invoke this fantasy of being just a plain spellcaster, and you can really focus on the spell system rather than any abilities that would modify or change it. And all these classes, all these things come together to create just a really interesting experience I think a lot of people will enjoy, and I really hope that people will want to sort of experience this game, dive into the play testing and try to improve it, because as it stands right now, I feel like there could be improvements. There are things in place where I think that's okay, so, there might be some modifications in there, and I think there'll be a lot of play testing potential to sort of fix that. But in my aim to try and make designing of games and the resulting dice mechanics a lot more fresh, I thoroughly suggest that you check out the likes of Daggerheart and other games that try to do something interesting with the dice mechanics. Check out Quest, check out Powered by the Apocalypse, other games that really try to do something different. Mothership, for example, Broken Empires, uses the D100 as well, to a very simulationist, what's the chance? It's simulation is just the word, it's like everything's quite grounded and realistic. And all these games are doing something different with their mechanics to make playing the game that much more of an enriching experience. We're not just here for sitting around with some pizza and friends. We're actually sat around to experience a game, and we love the mechanics. We're not just sat around going, oh god, here we go, let's play the greatest game in the world, but we're all kind of sick of the mechanics. Instead, we're sitting down to play this game that we love the mechanics of. We want to experience more. We want to play it more and dive into more of the mechanics and how they work. I feel like that's such a fun experience when you get to sit down and realize, like, this is so cool. I can do this and this and this in this system. Isn't that awesome? And there's not enough of that. I feel like there's a lot of people like the D20. It's like the face. It's like the face of D&D and TTRPGs at the moment, and people can't seem to break away. They can't seem to break away from making just clones of what we already have, which is a shame, because there's so much potential for great storytelling through mechanics that people seem to miss and just go, nah, let's just bring up the D20 again, and success, fail, and that's it. When there's so much we could be doing to change and modify and branch out into new experiences. So, with that said, and I've rambled for, oh my god, a long ass time, I'm gonna probably chop out some of the parts in there that I was like scrolling through to find more to talk about. But apart from that, I hope you've enjoyed. Just a bit of a chill, bit of a podcasty sort of experience as we talk about tabletop tidbits. I'm gonna have a glass of water because my throat is killing, and as I create a new video in the future, I might talk about class in terms of classes and systems. Might talk about, I don't know, maybe even internet drama regarding the tabletop community. Wouldn't that be fun if I'm feeling particularly spicy or neurospicy that day? Who knows? So, with any topics that you would like to see, leave them down in the comments. Any thoughts on what I've said, leave down in the comments. Any thoughts on the design that I've brought forward into my games, or I've talked about in my games here, leave it in the comments. I'd love to know if you think they're all terrible, or if you think they're all great, which is really what you're thinking, right? Please. I love you. Okay, so, with that being said, I love you all, and I'll see you next time.